Yeah, right.
So I do want to say, I don't think people who listen really know how well fed we are when we come into the studio here. Traditionally, Dawn cooks a wonderful meal. Or breakfast. We have a friend who likes to do this early in the morning, so we will do breakfast sometimes. But I think this is the first time when we've had a guest on the episode provide the meal. David!
All right.
Your Thanksgiving leftover shepherd's pie was the bomb.
It is the bomb every year.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. All right, we are gathered here today to talk about Loving, a movie starring Joel Edgerton and Ruth Negga. The film is directed by Jeff Nichols. Joel Edgerton's past credits include Zero Dark 30. He also played Owen Lars, Luke Skywalker's uncle in Attack of the Clones. And he's playing the same role right now in the Ben Kenobi series on Disney+. But David, I think you were saying earlier that Joel Edgerton has another role.
Yes, in the Ron Howard movie about the 13 ties that were trapped in the cave, he plays the Australian anesthesiologist that drugs each of the boys, and they were predicted that maybe 1/3 would get out alive, and every one of them got out of the cave alive.
Wow.
So he plays the doctor that went into the cave and did the anesthesiology.
Ruth Negga is one of my favorite actresses, and we'll talk about her performance in Loving in just a moment. But if you want to see another side of her, she was in the dark and twisted show called Preacher, which... You know Preacher?
Yes.
Yeah, it ran for 4 seasons. I think it was good for 2. It's one of those series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Red. Yeah, but it's just something... I was going to say something, but never mind. I can't. It came in my head. And
Seth Rogen was producing it. Is that who you're thinking
That's what
of?
it is. That's what I was thinking. Thank you. Oh, thank God Dawn is here.
I'm here for you, other wife.
Thank you. She's my sister.
Yeah.
So thank you. Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, Ruth Negga and Joel Edgerton were both nominated for a slew of awards for Loving. Yeah. Negga won awards for her role as Mildred Loving from the New York Film Critics, the African American Film Critics Association, the Alliance of Women Film Journalists, Satellite Awards, the Black Reel Awards, Palm Springs International Film Festival, and the Santa Barbara International Film Festival. She was the sole Academy Award nomination for Loving, and she lost it to Emma Stone for La La Land. She was nominated for a Tony Award.
I'm sorry, we're speechless.
I was wondering what was going on.
That's disappointing.
Yes.
Very unsurprising, but disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it makes up for it a little bit. She was nominated for a Tony Award in 2022 for playing Lady Macbeth. And it was Daniel Craig who was playing Macbeth.
No, doesn't make up for it.
No, okay.
No. If you get the shaft, not getting the shaft later doesn't make up for it.
Yeah.
That's not how that works.
Apples and oranges.
Yep.
2 different things.
Yep.
Well, Joel Edgerton and Ruth Negga portray Richard and Mildred Loving. They are a married couple who live in Virginia in the 1950s. Their state will not allow them to live together as husband and wife due to laws against interracial marriage. Loving gets a 7 out of 10 from IMDb, an 88% from Rotten Tomatoes, and a 79% rating from Metacritic. And I'm really pleased to have several cohorts here with me today. We have Lolita. Hello, Lolita.
Hey, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
It's great to be here.
Good to have you here. We also have David, who was last with me for Amadeus.
Indeed. So, Rob, good to be here.
Good to be here. And we have Dawn. I think the last time Dawn and I were on the podcast was for The Imitation Game.
Yes.
And Lolita, you were for Coal Miner's Daughter,
right.
I think, for the last time. Yes, wonderful. Good to have all of you here. We are recording this episode in a post-Roe world. In June of 2022, Samuel Alito and 5 conservative justices decided to overturn Roe v. Wade and take away the constitutional rights of 52% of the U.S. population. How you guys doing?
No comment. I would comment, but...
Comment away, sister.
Comment away.
Am I allowed to cuss on this?
You can cuss as much as you want.
As bullshit. Took away our rights.
Mm-hmm.
No, I would say it's elephant shit because it's bigger than bullshit.
That's true. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. People don't even realize the true impact of Roe being overturned. They think it's about abortion, and they do not understand that it is about your right to privacy. And
Thank
the
you, Dawn.
number of other laws that can potentially now be overturned, and the rulings that can be overturned because Roe was overturned.
This guy has a domino effect.
Yeah. So we have 6 people who decided the fate of 52% of this nation, taking away our right to be able to self-determination, to decide if and when to have families, which allows people to avoid poverty, pursue a more stable life if they choose to have children. It's all been taken away.
But it's also taken away male rights as well, because we play a role in this. And I think it's a travesty, this decision, because people talk about their most personal stuff as a couple. And this also eliminates the male voice who would say, yes, I think this is the right decision, that this is not something we can do right now. So I think it's beyond just 52%. I think there's a lot of males that feel disenfranchised by this decision as well.
Mm-hmm. Shortly after Roe was overturned, Justice Clarence Thomas cited 3 cases the Supreme Court had decided as being demonstrably erroneous decisions in his terms. The cases he mentioned were Griswold versus Connecticut. That was the 1965 ruling in which the Supreme Court said married couples have the right to obtain contraceptives. He also mentioned Lawrence v. Texas, which in 2003 established the right to engage in private sexual acts. And in 2015, the ruling in Obergefell v. Hodges, which said there is a right to same-sex marriage. The conservative wing of the Supreme Court is of the belief that if the right is not explicitly called out in the Constitution, then it is not a right. Now, the thing that stood out to a lot of people when Justice Clarence Thomas made these comments was that he didn't mention the topic of our discussion today, which is Loving v. Virginia. And that's notable. That decision was decided in 1967 and struck down all laws in the United States banning interracial marriage. Now, Justice Thomas is a black man. He's married to his wife, Ginny, who is a white woman. And the court decision that allows their marriage to be legal in this country is predicated along the same lines which Thomas finds erroneous.
Can we say a little hypocrisy there?
Possibly, but let's find out how much hypocrisy here, because from a legal standpoint, Loving v. Virginia is viewed in a different column by Thomas because it was decided using the 14th Amendment, which provides all people equal protection under the law. When the Supreme Court ruled in Richard and Mildred Loving's favor, they ruled that laws banning interracial marriage violate the equal protection and dual process clauses of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Justice Thomas should probably go back and read the decisions for the cases he feels were decided erroneously. Griswold v. Connecticut was decided using the 4th and 5th Amendments, which have to do with government intrusion into one's private life. Lawrence v. Texas has to do with sodomy laws in the U.S., and Obergefell v. Hodges, which had to do with gay marriage, were both struck down using, does anyone want to guess? The 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. So if those were erroneously decided, then Loving v. Virginia must also be erroneously decided, according to Justice Thomas. But he didn't mention that one. Now, since we are talking about the constitutional rights of citizens in our country now, and how they were lost and how they may be lost in the future, I thought it was a good idea to take a look at Loving. This is a film I've wanted to talk about since I started this podcast, and I'm glad to have all of you here to talk about it, because we have some personal history in the room as well. Lolita, you were married to a person of another race?
Yes, I was.
Oh, and your parents as well?
My parents.
So, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I was married to a Polish man. He was a white Caucasian man, and I'm of Asian American descent. But I just happened to live during the time where it wasn't looked down upon. But my parents, my mom was Japanese and my dad was Filipino. They had to, back in 1952 or 53, they had to get permission from 3 different governments. They didn't have a problem getting it from Japan. They didn't have any problems getting it from the Philippines, which I thought was kind of odd because they were at war with one another. Remember when the Japanese took over the villages in the Philippines? So I thought that was it. But when I was talking to my mom, she said, no, it was the United States. They would not approve of their marriage. And till this day, my mom gave birth to my brother. The Americans would look at her child as being a bastard because they did not look at, they did not approve their marriage, which blows my mind. It still blows my mind. When she was telling me this, I was like, what? She said it as a joke. I had to get away with, my mom said something like, she was so mad at my dad one day, and she said, I had a chance to get away with with your father, but I stuck with him. She goes, had 3 opportunities. Japan approved it, Philippines, she was the United States. My dad had worked really hard. He was in the Navy, of course, and I really don't know all the paperwork he had to go through to get approved. But till this day, it just really boggles my mind that it boggles my mind at the same time. It doesn't surprise me, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because especially after watching The Loving Story. And I went, we're supposed to be, one of these countries that is supposed, it's supposed to be forward and tolerant. Well, we're not.
We're not.
No. And I still don't think we are. But it was really hard for them back then. And my mom just happened to mention it because I was getting married to my husband at the time, who was Caucasian, and she says, you guys have it really easy. And I just didn't know what she was talking about. And that's when she told me. And I was like really shocked that she had to get permission from 3 different governmental entities from different countries.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really crazy. But she kept it to herself.
Now, when you married your husband, were you aware of Loving v. Virginia?
I had no idea.
So you had no idea why you were able to marry someone who wasn't yours?
No.
Wow.
Yeah. I come from the Bay Area, so it's a melting pot up there. So, and it still is. It's a lot more than it was in San Diego in the 60s. But as you grow older and you start meeting different people, it wasn't really frowned upon. Well, I didn't think it was frowned upon. Huh. But my mom was really shocked. Oh, she wasn't really shocked. She was just like, you have it really, really good. It's so easy for you to get married now. Mm-hmm. Then my dad would talk about it. But I think it was my mom that was more, I think she was bothered by it because she was pregnant. Mm-hmm. And she was married, recognized by the Philippine government and also with the Japanese government. But then the United States, it took a long time. And I think it bothered her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And David, you're married to, is the proper term a Thai person or Thai national?
I think either. But so picking up on Lolita, the paradox here is it's not only race, but it's also gender. So as a white male, if I married an Asian woman before 1954, with some flexes of the immigration law, I might be able to bring her in. But if I was a white woman who married an Asian man because of the exclusion acts that were in place up until actually 1965, I could be, believe it or not, denaturalized. I could lose my citizenship. Wow. So when you think of Loving versus Virginia, you could be a white woman who marries somebody who is not, because of our laws, ever able to be naturalized. And that could lead to a process of stripping you of your U.S. citizenship. So like Lolita now, I mean, when I married Pitikon, my wife, it was not a big deal because at this point it had become accepted. But if you go back in time and change our gender roles, it would have been prohibitive. And we also have to remember that with the exclusion laws for Asians, They were put in place starting in 1882 and really didn't get fully struck down until 1965. So while we look at Loving versus Virginia, on the West Coast in particular, it has a resonance here because the same prohibitions, I don't know what the state laws were, but the same prohibitions might have been in place for interracial marriage.
Yeah, and the acts were usually very bluntly named because I think the act you're referring to is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which specifically excluded.
That was the first, but you
Yes.
had other acts that were put in place that prohibited or made almost impossible Asian immigration to the United States.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, do you know what happens to American citizens who are denaturalized? Does that simply mean that they take away the rights you have as a citizen to vote and things like that? Because they can't just send you to another country. A country would have to accept you.
Well, you'd be basically a stateless person. Now, you have to understand the racism that was put in place was, I think it would be very hard pressed to find many white women back in the day that would risk all that to even with love to marry.
Because you couldn't get a passport then either because you're
No,
not a citizen.
you'd be a stateless person.
Wow.
Wow.
When you're denaturalized, it means you're no longer a U.S. citizen.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's nuts.
Wow. So the movie Loving, which came out in 2014, I want to make clear it should not be confused with the movie that appeared on Showtime in 1996. That movie starred Layla Rochon, Timothy Hutton, and Ruby Dee. And Mildred Loving said, quote, "There wasn't much of it that was true, except for I had 3 kids." However, the movie did provide her with enough money to put siding on her house and shutters. So she did benefit from some way in that, which is nice. But what we're going to talk about today is the 2014 film Loving, and find out what we liked and didn't like about the film. So I'll open it up to the group. What did you like about the film Loving?
It wasn't overly dramatic. It didn't fall into melodrama. It just felt like people were telling their story. And at times it was painful, and at times it was joyful, and at times it was really watching a woman fighting a system that she refused to comply with without a fight.
I agree. They don't do a lot of what biopics typically do. It's a very quiet film in that regard. And to your point, Dawn, there's one scene in particular I think of, which is Richard comes home and finds Mildred in the living room with a camera person and an interviewer. And he makes a motion that he wants to talk to her outside. And he says, "I don't want them here." And she says, "They're here to help." And she turns around and gives him a look and goes back inside. And what follows is he then walks into the living room, sits in the rocking chair, and the person with the camera turns the camera on him. And you realize that he realizes this is what they have to do in order to get what they want. And in any other biopic, that would be a whole argument that needs to be verbalized. Mildred would have to tell him that. And they don't do that in this film in a number of areas. They just let the character's actions inform the viewer of where the character is and how they're relating to what's taking place. And I love the quietness of this film, and that it tends to just do nothing that a biopic typically would.
I think it's factual.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I enjoyed. And I think the fact that, like you said, they didn't have to say much, but by not saying much, it showed much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think what it captures is a real couple.
Yeah.
Where everybody has the nod and the wink and like, are you kidding me? And it's just known. And so you don't have to overact it. And the other thing I liked is I thought the two leads just they looked ordinary. I mean, they didn't try to dress the couple up as what am I trying to look?
Like supermodel-y,
Supermodel-y, like an
typical
Angelina
Yes.
Jolie,
Yeah.
and that sort of, or, I was thinking Halle Berry or something, just, I thought they both, when you look at the pictures, the real pictures, they really got the look down.
Yeah.
But they were attractive, but they weren't, they weren't over the top. And I just thought the way they interplayed off each other was beautifully done throughout the whole movie.
Yeah.
And how fundamentally ordinary they were, but also how fundamentally profound what they were looking for truly was.
Yeah.
Nicely said.
I do want to add this. It was the simplicity,
Yeah.
Yes.
right?
Oh,
It wasn't melodramatic, although they were, without saying much. But it was just the simplicity of the whole movie, just the way they lived, their characters. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't a blockbuster where they had to dress
Yeah.
up. It was just so simple.
And
You can relate.
Yeah, and even the arrest scene, which you would almost expect to see, fireworks and all and then just sort of knowing that they're up against this system, and there's no way they're going to win. So there's no point in being melodramatic. I mean, she is sitting in a jail cell for 3 or 4 days, and they just portray her pain. But again, it's not screaming. Yeah. And the same for him. He's not yelling like Stella, Stella.
Mildred.
They don't accept it, but at the same time, it's very clear they don't accept it. But it's not melodramatic how they react to the injustice that was given to them.
They seem to know where to pour their energy, and screaming in the jail cell was not it.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
And for a film that's about fighting the system, there's also no big third act rally that you typically find in a fight against the system film.
Right.
It's very quiet even in the regard of the climax.
Well,
of the Supreme Court decision.
I just decided to write a letter to Robert Kennedy. I mean, that's what got the whole, sort of the legal case going. And, God bless Bobby Kennedy for, or his staff sending to the ACLU. But that's sort of the big fireworks was that she just decided to send a letter. Mm-hmm. And who would have thought that the letter would have been responded to?
Yeah, and Loving is really interesting to discuss because of the source material for the film. Many times when we talk about a film, the source material is a book or a magazine article. And what we found in the past is that the truthfulness of the film is only as good as the source material. So if you refer back to our episode on Never Cry Wolf, that source material was not factual in any way, and therefore the movie wasn't. But Loving is the first biopic we have discussed where the biopic is based off of a documentary. And that documentary is called The Loving Story. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was fascinating to go back because the Lovings allowed themselves to be filmed during the course of their trial. And you have the real footage of Richard and Mildred. And in the real footage, Richard looks just as uncomfortable as Joel Edgerton looks
Right.
in the film. I mean, he looks like he wants to gnaw his leg off every time he's in a press conference. But he realizes this is what he has to do. Another thing I want to point out about this movie that I found fascinating was the way gender roles were presented. Because I noticed that it is Mildred who comforts Richard throughout the course of the film. All throughout. Even the poster has her holding him. Mm-hmm. So Mildred is the driver in this film. She's the one who's pushing the case forward. She's the one who's making things happen. And I found it fascinating that not only is this film about race, but it's also about gender to a large degree, because when we see that part in the film where Michael Shannon, he's portraying the photographer from Life magazine, Gray Valet, and he's taking those pictures where Richard lies on the couch and puts his head in Mildred's lap. Those are real pictures that Gray Valet took. That is all real. So the fact that Richard, as uncomfortable as he was being in the spotlight, was comfortable enough with Mildred to let himself be seen as what would not typically be a male dominant role, laying his head in her lap, to me is just fascinating regarding him.
I agree. She seemed like a very strong person.
Mm-hmm.
And if it weren't for her, I don't think it would have gone as far as it had.
Yeah.
She was definitely the driver, but again, a very humble driver, but she knew what she had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned that, that overall, I think everybody thought because they were socioeconomically, they weren't rich, they were simple people. And because they were simple people, they thought that, oh, they're dumb. Mm-hmm. They're not going to go anywhere. But she wasn't.
No.
Apparently she was a prolific writer. They even said that she can articulate her words probably better than I can right now. And I think they underestimated her, but I think you're right. I think she was a strong person that was the glue. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, he was a willing participant because he did love her. And you know some of the things that he said, that he wasn't going to divorce her and all that stuff. But I really think that... wasn't it her cousin who recommended that she write to Robert Kennedy?
Yes.
And she certainly did. I don't know if I would have written to Robert Kennedy, but she had the determination, knowing that the law or the Virginia law was just wrong.
There's a scene that I really love, and to me it's really funny in a way, when they're sitting in the lawyer's office. And the lawyer says to them, we've arranged for a photographer to come out to your house, if it's okay with you. And the camera cuts to Richard, who just kind of grunts and shrugs his shoulder. And Mildred looks at Richard, and then she looks at the lawyer and says, that would be fine. I think that says everything about where they were in this and how much Mildred was driving it.
Right. But don't you think that he knew it, that even though he didn't like it, it was something that had to be done? And, I mean, what do you think, Dawn?
I think so. And I think she was the one who was able to get him across the finish line on each of those.
Yeah.
Because it's not always easy. She weighed it out. And, I mean, we'll get into more where she, acquiesced to him later as we chat about it. But, she obviously was making a lot of decisions while recognizing how difficult it was on him and how much he would rather not be in that position in the first place.
Well, I also think that he was of the two more private.
Yeah.
And I think that there's also an interpersonal dynamic that goes there, but he also probably acknowledged that she was better able to challenge it. I think he just wanted to be left alone, and she, I think as a black woman, realized, maybe more so than him as a white male, that was never going to happen. So I think that her willing to push it had a lot to do with her position, and that he went along and acknowledged it. But I think, again, in that era, as a white male, I think it was all new to him.
Yeah, I can see that.
But don't you think he was ahead of his time? I mean, with all back in the 50s, the machismo, I'm the head of the household, I'm the breadwinner, you're the wife that stays home. I mean, for him to, I guess, quickly come to terms about what she was doing, and maybe it's because deep inside he knew what she was doing, but I really thought he was going to, this really was unexpected for me, that he would actually, I wouldn't say give in, but more or less understand why it had to be done, if that makes sense. I really expected him to really fight her a lot more, and he never did.
Yeah.
And I agree. He didn't fight her, but I think we also have to acknowledge that he was working. I mean, most of the scenes that you see him is he's working. So he is away from home.
That's true.
And he's supporting the family. So he does not have. I mean, she's raising 3 kids. So I'm not meaning to belittle what she's doing, but what little money that they have, he's bringing in. So I think he's focused on earning. And what you get in the whole picture is he's a builder. I mean, he's very concrete. I mean, when they talk about the house, he's drawing the house. So I think he is a much more concrete thinker. And I think she demonstrated throughout the movie a bit more ability to take on abstraction and think more conceptually.
Right.
Well, and I think it shows the strength of their marriage, too. And I don't want to digress too much, but, you know, when you have someone who is an activist or someone who is involved in their community, whatever it happens to be, then there's someone else who is taking care of those other things. And they had this balance. So, you know, they could have the house because he was making sure money was coming in. And they were eventually able to have their marriage because she continued on her path of activism.
Right.
You know, I talk about this when I was volunteering for the Obama campaign, and I was there 40 hours a week after working 40 hours a week. And I could do that because Rob was home and he took all the chores, all the errands.
Good for you, Rob.
For
Thank you.
first during the primary, then we had a break, and then during the general election. So that's, you know, several months where,
Sure.
and I couldn't do that otherwise. And that's a very small act in comparison or in contrast to what they did.
Right.
But you see the importance of having a good relationship, and that's how you make those changes happen.
So, Don, are you in essence saying it takes a couple to make a village?
But you know that one scene where, like you said, the photographers or the reporters, and they were out in the when he goes, "Can I speak with you for a minute?" He pulled her outside. I really thought that they were going to argue, and they didn't. It was like, oh.
And it's interesting. I don't want to get too much into the facts, but I don't have a space for this later on, so it's okay to mention. But one of the lawyers, Hirschkopf, mentions they were so completely on the same page. He said they never disagreed in front of us. And he said, I don't think they had a disagreement away from us. They were just so completely on the same page. He was amazed by it. He also mentions that when you look at Richard, and I think it's interesting that if we're looking at race, the stereotypes you can place on Richard. And Hirschkopf says he looked like a redneck. He did not look like the type of person.
That was what their attorney said?
That's what their attorney said.
Okay.
Who would be supportive of what he was in the middle of. I mean, look at it. He looked like a redneck. He had a redneck. He had a redneck. He worked outdoors. He raced cars, stereotypically.
So that goes back to what Lo was saying about they were underestimated. They looked at this white guy, and they figured he had whatever his agenda was that aligned with what they believed a white dude from the South was all about.
But even, Don, even more than that, he raced cars, but the people who he raced with and that were on his side were all black guys.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he wasn't racing, Robert E. Leaf and Dukes of Hazzard.
All right. Was there anything you did not like about the film?
No.
Nothing that really comes to mind.
No.
I mean, I thought it was solid throughout.
I did too. It's one of my favorite films. I just love it. Lolita, when she got here tonight, said, "Thanks for making me cry."
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
That moment where Richard just says, "Tell them I love my wife."
Yeah. I started crying. I did. That's where I started tearing up. It's like,
but
it can't be. You can't.
It's just that simple.
It's that simple. Exactly. You can't get any more simple than that.
Yeah.
But also the simplicity is, again, this goes against the grain of your average Hollywood picture. When she gets the news that they won the case, it's so subtly played. I mean, it's got to be the most subtly played dramatic moment that I've seen in a movie.
Yeah.
And that's that moment where I talk about where they show that, he has agreed to do this, whatever the reasons were they decided between the two of us, and she is the driver. But she also seemed to recognize how private a person he was.
Oh,
And the only thing she could give him in this process was to agree to not go to the Supreme Court when the ruling came down, even though she wanted to go.
Yeah.
And so that's what she gave him. And I was just really touched by that.
Yeah, I would
So
agree.
as was I. That really touched
Because
me.
my God, if it was me, I don't know if I could do that. I'd
Exactly.
be like, peace out, baby.
Yeah.
I've worked this hard for it.
I've worked this hard. I'm heading
I
to
want to see it
DC.
to the end, right? But
it-
I think they had such a mutual respect
Yeah.
for one
Yeah.
another that she did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it would have been when it was the court decided. It would have been at the oral arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they're arguing your fate.
Yeah.
So why would you not want to be there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she really surrendered on that piece, and I get it. That was the gift that she could give him in all of this.
And I think it's really the simplicity of all of it, which really cuts me to the core. Because when Lolita said, "Thanks for making me cry," I said, I was tearing up as I was writing this episode. I'm tearing up already as we're talking about it, and we aren't even deep into it yet. But it's just the simplicity of it that they had to fight so hard for something that Dawn and I take for granted. It's the same as LGBT. You know, there's no fucking reason why they should have to fight so hard
Totally agree.
just to have the basic rights. And so, yeah, that really gets me. But we're going to take a look at all of it. So before I mention what we're going to talk about, I want to hear from you if we're going to give the movie a score simply as a movie. 1 out of 5 stars. What would you give it, Dawn?
Oh, 5.
Oh, 5.
My usual 4.9.
We'll round it up to 5. 5 for me as well. And honestly, for me,
Naysayer.
and for me, I'm happy to have turned you guys onto this film. I'm glad you like it so much because it's really been a favorite of mine.
Can I say something real
Yes.
quick? Okay. So I'm one of those people that I don't sleep, but I was really tired, and I said, "Well, I better watch it." Right. So it was 12:30 when I turned it on, and Tyler goes, my son comes in the room and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to watch this movie because I have to do a podcast with Uncle Rob," and he said, "Right now?" And I said, "That's okay. I'm just going to turn it off. You know, I'm just going to watch it for a half an hour and I'll turn it off." No, I watched that in addition to the documentary. So it was
Wow.
like almost 4:00 in the morning. And then the next morning I go, "Oh my God, you got to watch this. It's so good."
And wouldn't it have felt disrespectful in some ways to have turned it off
Yes,
midway
it
through?
would have been totally
I feel like it would have been
disrespectful.
slapped to Mildred and Richard Loving.
Yeah, that's how
And I would have had to
felt.
explain it to their children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
I'm so
It's like,
sorry.
oh my God.
I'm so sorry I turned off your family's movie in the middle.
I said, I can't do that. I've got to watch it
you
to
can't.
the end. Yeah.
You can't.
And then, of course, I said, "Oh, look, there's a documentary. Well, maybe I'll just click on this too." And it was just, I just couldn't stop. And I did it again last night. Wow, twice.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how much I enjoyed the movie and the documentary.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I'm putting these episodes together, I'll usually write a little bit, then go back and watch it. And there's things that jump out to me more from the research I've done that are really, really subtle. So we'll talk about some of those. But what we're going to talk about today when we fact check this film is we're going to take a look first at who were Richard and Mildred Loving and their lives. We're also going to go deep into what exactly was the law that kept them from living as a married couple. Because to just say that they couldn't live together in Virginia is just scratching the surface of this law. We're also going to talk about one that may seem a little odd in this conversation, and that is, was Mildred black? We're also going to look at, did Mildred really send that letter to Robert Kennedy? And how was their case depicted in the film? Was it accurate? Okay, let's go ahead and start out with who were Richard and Mildred Loving. What was in the movie? The movie presents Richard and Mildred as two people who are in love with each other and simply want the right to be married without being arrested. You know, small things. They are very quiet and reserved people who are placed in extraordinary circumstances in Caroline County, Virginia. So what really happened? In Caroline County, specifically in Central Point, the races mixed without a problem. Mm-hmm. Richard and Mildred met as adolescents while Mildred was attending an all-black school. She was 11 and he was 17. Richard would come to the Jeter house to hear her 7 brothers play what Mildred called hillbilly music. Keep in mind that at this time, Richard and his friends attended different schools and churches due to segregation. Richard and Mildred started dating when she entered high school. Richard's closest friends with whom he drag raced were black, and he hung out with Mildred's brothers and extended family. Richard and his 2 friends owned a car together, as we see in the movie, and among them they acquired 99 trophies, 33 apiece.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Richard said of Caroline County, quote, "There's just a few people that live in this community, a few white and a few colored. And as I grew up and as they grew up, we all helped one another. It was all in all, I say, mixed together to start with and just kept going that way." It would seem at the outset that this would be a rather straightforward story to fact check. However, the story of the Lovings has been told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Sometimes the inaccuracy comes from the author not doing their due diligence to get to the real truth, and they repeat an inaccuracy that was published before. Other times, the history has been shared in a consistently vague manner, which has led it to be spun through different perspectives. And as I have conducted the research for this discussion, I've made every effort to get to some solid areas. So the first fuzzy area that is shown at the beginning of the movie is when Mildred tells Richard that she is pregnant. Mm-hmm. What was your impression when you saw that scene?
That it seemed like a natural next step for them. That it was...
Mm-hmm.
That was the next step in their lives. He seemed pretty content with the idea.
So it sounds like you felt it was his child?
I don't know if it was his child.
Okay. And from Richard's response to the news, as you mentioned, Don, it would appear that it is his child in a way. Mm. And in my research, I frequently found the phrase repeated, Richard and Mildred decided to get married when Mildred became pregnant. Mm-hmm. Couple this with the fact that you frequently see it reported that the Lovings had 3 children.
Right.
Okay. And it's easy to think that the child Mildred is pregnant with at the beginning of the movie is the couple's first child. They raised that child together, but it was not their first. That child was Sydney, and Sydney came from a previous relationship that Mildred was in, and Sydney was born a year and a half before the Lovings were married in Washington, D.C. The information about this relationship is never mentioned in stories about the Lovings. But if
it doesn't seem consequential.
No, but if we're looking at a timeline for the Lovings, and you take a look at it, if Mildred and Richard started dating when she was in high school, and she became pregnant when she was 18, then what happened in the meantime?
Sometimes people break up or get back together. Sometimes people aren't dating exclusively. In the end, it's no one's business, and maybe that's why it's been left out.
Could be. And there's really no information about this period of Mildred's life that's out there at all, other than Sydney was their first child, and that's how you see it frequently reported. Mm-hmm. The father of Sydney is never mentioned in accounts of the Loving story, and Richard raised and loved Sydney as his own. Mm-hmm. Sydney retained the surname of Jeter, Mildred's maiden name, and listed Richard as his stepfather in Social Security documents.
So if I can interject, wouldn't a birth certificate have had to name the father?
Not necessarily, and I can say this from personal experience because we don't know who my mother's father was. And if they are adopted, many times counties will scrub the original father's name. So it's
you can strike that comment, but I would think in Virginia at that point they would have pursued, especially since the child was not born in marriage, that they would have pursued that. You
can also list unknown.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I've seen
Which
that.
is sometimes safer.
Yeah, I actually seen that.
Yeah.
The first child, that is Richard and Mildred's, who was born 4 months after their marriage, and that is Donald, on October 8th, 1958. And their daughter Peggy, who you see in the film, was born in 1960. So what exactly was the law that kept Richard and Mildred from being married in Virginia? what was in the movie is that it shows that Richard and Mildred went to Washington, D.C. to get married and returned to Virginia as a married couple. They were arrested when officers came into their bedroom in the middle of the night. They were tried and sentenced to 1 year in prison, which the judge suspended if they stayed away from Virginia for 25 years. So what really happened? When Richard and Mildred left to get married in Washington, D.C., he was 26 and she was 20. D.C. did not require blood tests. Mildred later says that she believes that Richard knew that they could be arrested if they returned to Virginia, but she thought the law concerned getting married in Virginia, not being married in Virginia. In an interview, Richard said that he knew other biracial married couples in Caroline County who had not been arrested. He believed that he and Mildred were arrested because, quote, someone talked.
Who snitched?
Oh my God, I kept wondering that.
It's never come out. And in Caroline County, as it was mentioned in the movie and as we've mentioned here, everyone mixed. It wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem for Richard and Mildred to date. It wasn't a problem for them to be in public and he's racing cars and he has his arm around her. That was not a problem in Caroline County.
It was obviously a problem for someone in Caroline County.
No, what was a problem was them being married
Right.
in Caroline County. As long as they were dating, everyone was fine.
Right, so obviously someone had a problem with it once they got married.
Yeah.
But what
you
was
think-
it? What was it about Richard and Mildred Loving that made someone want?
And do you
them
think, Don,
arrested.
that it was someone in their circle?
That's what I wonder. Or maybe someone whose ass he kicked in one of his drag races.
What is drag races or something?
You know what? Regardless of who it was, it's a good thing they picked Richard and Mildred Loving.
Yeah.
It resulted in a Supreme Court decision which improved the lives of a lot of people. On July 14th, 1958, just 5 weeks after the Lovings had married, Sheriff Garnett Brooks and 3 deputies, by the way, that would be every deputy in Caroline County,
I'm quite sure.
Yeah.
came into the Jeter home. The Lovings were living with Mildred's family at the time. Now, it's odd that Sheriff Brooks brought every deputy in the county, because when Sheriff Brooks would arrest moonshiners, he would go by himself, or sometimes he would just bring his German Shepherd.
I think maybe the sheriff had an axe to grind because they also came in the middle of the night.
Now,
That's maximum humiliation
That
and
bothered
scare.
me too.
Yeah.
not just maximum humiliation. Why do you... He could have arrested them any point during the
Yes.
day. Why do you think he and the deputies went in the middle of the night?
Because they were in the
That's what I
bed.
just said. Yeah, because they were in
They were
bed.
in the
They
bed.
were vulnerable. Maximum scare. Yeah.
Yeah, because they were in
To
the
be
bed.
extra shitty. That's why.
And also, it was a no-knock warrant. I mean, they didn't knock, and I mean, they never. The Lovings never asked to see where's your warrant for entering my house. Right? I mean, you're supposed to. I mean, you're supposed to have present a warrant to enter somebody's house.
And Don, I will take your extra shitty, and I will raise you an extra shitty, because they were trying to catch them having sex,
Oh, I bet.
which
I
would
was about to say that was the marital bed.
would have been an additional crime on top of being married in Virginia.
Yeah. So the idea that, the sheriff would have just had to do this no matter what. There's some layers there.
Oh yeah.
It was purposeful.
Yeah.
Very purposeful.
When the cops found the Lovings bleary-eyed with flashlights in their eyes in their bed, the sheriff asked Richard, "Who is this woman you're with?" Mildred answered, "I'm his wife," and pointed at their marriage certificate hanging on the wall, which is exactly what we see in the movie. The same marriage certificate that was used as evidence against them for committing a crime of cohabitating together. Just the thought that your marriage certificate could be used as evidence against you.
I'm sure back then.
Oh, there's layers of disgusting we're going to get into in this part, which are just appalling. And the sheriff replied, as in the movie, "Not here, you're not." Now, I'm going to read to you the actual indictment that was brought against Richard Perry Loving for being a white person, and the said Mildred Dolores Jeter, being a colored person, did unlawfully and feloniously go out of the state of Virginia for the purpose of being married and with the intention of returning to the state of Virginia, and were married out of the state of Virginia, to wit, in the District of Columbia, on June 2nd, 1958, and afterwards returned to and resided in the county of Carroll and state of Virginia, cohabitating as man and wife against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth.
Wow.
It's frankly hard to take that statement right now without just laughing. It's going, what idiocy is that language?
It just makes you speechless.
Yeah, it really does.
That even existed.
Yeah.
But it did.
It did. Now, the law that Richard and Mildred were charged with violating was the Racial Purity Act of 1924. It was an...
I'm sorry.
No, don't be. It was an anti-miscegenation law that was designed to keep the races from mixing and to maintain white supremacy. In particular, it prevented whites from being with non-whites in order to prevent, quote, the quagmire of mongrelization.
Oh, my God.
The basis of the law was what was called the one-drop rule.
Mm-hmm.
If a person who identified as white contained one drop of blood from another race, they would be considered non-white.
You know, and even with DNA tests right now, I mean, that's a threshold that we can't even begin to approach. So you just have to look at that, and well, I mean, that has roots in our own Constitution, where we established representation based on 5% rule of blood. So it's an old legal, but how you actually could get under a microscope and say, oh, that's the 5 or the 1% blood. I mean, it's just absurd.
Can you believe that?
In the film Loving, the depiction of the masochistic tendencies of law enforcement toward people of another race would seem to be cliched from what has been presented in other films. But cliches exist for a reason. When we see in the film that a guard says to an inmate while Mildred is incarcerated, "Maybe I should put you in there with her," this is not an invention of the writer. According to Mildred, this really happened. In the same vein, the delay in Mildred's release on bond really took place, but the film left out the details. The bonding company who had posted bond for Richard was told by the authorities that if they posted bond for Mildred, they would put Richard back in jail. Mildred was released a few days later, without a bond, but in her father's care.
Wow.
Which we see in the film, they just don't give the explanation as to why it worked out that way. And I think it's important to understand the timeline of the two arrests of Richard and Mildred Loving, because this is where the film takes its largest liberties. The first arrest, the one where the sheriff burst into their bedroom, took place on July 11th, 1958. On the advice of their lawyer, Frank Beasley, they entered pleas of not guilty. The movie makes it look like it was a pretty quick succession from arrest to incarceration to Judge Bazille's judgment. But this went to a grand jury. The grand jury hearing later that year, the four women brought formal charges against them. The Lovings waived a jury trial because they did not feel a jury would be sympathetic towards them. They were given a suspended sentence by Judge Bazille and a 25-year moratorium on entering the state as a married couple on January 6th, 1959. So 6 months later. So it was 6 months between their arrest and being in the courtroom with Bazille. By the way, when you see the Lovings and Bazille in the courtroom, that was the courtroom in which the Lovings were sentenced.
Oh,
Wow.
So they use the same location.
They used the same location. The jail was also the same
the
location.
same? Wow.
Yeah, and this film was largely also filmed in Caroline County in Virginia as well, which is unusual for a film to film where the locations actually were. The film shows that the second arrest took place when the couple came back to Virginia for the birth of Sidney, who was delivered by Richard's mother, who was a midwife. The film shows Loving's lawyer, Frank Beasley, lying to the judge and stating that he misinformed them about being able to return to the state for the birth of their child. In reality, the Lovings returned in March of 1959. So that would be 2 months after they were sentenced by Bazille. And this was during the Easter holiday.
Wasn't it Easter or something like that?
So they came back to visit for Easter. It wasn't for the birth of a child. Mm-hmm. In reality, they had been told by Beasley, their attorney, that they could visit if they did not sleep in the same house. Beasley went in front of Bazille and admitted his real error to the judge. And this is what kept the Lovings from going to jail for a second time. So the movie presents it as Beasley's covering for them. In reality, Beasley really made that error.
But, I mean, he didn't have to go before the judge and said, I made an error. So I don't know if it really changes his role as somebody who had some sympathy for them.
Yeah.
Because he could have said, I never told them that.
Right.
So, racial purity law of 1924.
I love it.
Yeah, just amazing, isn't it?
But it's also, you have to take a look at the thinking about race in that era. I mean, during that period of time, you had Madison Grant talking about the decline of the great races, and they were saying that Italians and Russians and Yugoslavs and Greeks were not white. Mm-hmm. And so you had a hierarchy of race, and so this was all part of an anti-immigrant, but also putting in what was the latest scientific thinking about race. Yeah. And so when you think about Italians, I mean, think about Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, going on and on about, we will not be replaced, and yet his Italian ancestry was being railed against back in the beginning of the 1900s. When we think about race during this period of time, it's construed as we understand white right now, but it was actually a much more calibrated notion of what was really white. You had variations that were sort of like white, but not really white. So when you talk about this law in 1925, it was part of that racialized thinking.
Yeah. And speaking of race, we're going to take a look at, was Mildred black? So what was in the movie? I had to go back and double check this in the movie, because this is a movie that is purely built on the race of the two principal characters. That's the whole crux of it. But in the movie Loving, no one mentions Mildred's race.
Did anyone mention Richard's?
Yes.
Who?
It's a conversation in the bar when he's talking with his friends, and the one we'll get into that later. But the only time when Mildred's race is mentioned is in her letter to the American Civil Liberties Union. And in real life, we need to look at how Mildred was referred to and how she referred to herself. So in the film, a photographer comes to the house to shoot pictures. This photographer is played by Michael Shannon. He plays Gray Valet, who is shooting pictures for a Life magazine article. And this article came out in March 18th, 1966. And we will have a link to that article available on our website, biopicsmostlysuck.com/loving. Now, the first line of the article says, she is Negro, he is white, and they are married. Mildred's grandson, Donald, that is the son of Mildred's daughter, Peggy. Okay. He's now the holder of the family history. He says his grandmother was not black. She was Indian.
Yeah. Native American, right? Cherokee or something like that?
Let's go ahead and break this down. The Racial Purity Act of 1924 was written with an exception. It's amazing how complicated racists make this.
I've read that. It cracks me up, really.
It's hysterical.
You'll find out how hysterical this is.
White families who had descended from Native Americans lobbied the state, and what was called the Pocahontas exception
Can you believe that? Yeah.
was included as an exemption to the racial purity law. Now that means if a person could show they descended from Pocahontas, they would be allowed to marry white people and live in Virginia as a couple. But Virginia limited the use of this exemption to reservation Indians on the Pumacay and Mattapony reservations in King William County.
Plus, you have to think back, it was not until 1954 that American Indians were given full citizenship. Mm-hmm. So even with the Pocahontas law that was passed when?
This was part of the act in 1924.
So you still, it didn't really,
the exception.
It really didn't provide you a lot of relief because you were not technically allowed to be an American citizen until 1954. So you have 28 years, 29 years where you're still not seen as a citizen.
But didn't they make that exception because the descendants of the Pocahontas was very proud of their heritage, but they were also an old Virginia family with money?
Oh, yeah.
And that's
It's
why
amazing how loud money speaks.
Yeah, it's not fun. It always does.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
loud.
So they were an old Virginia family with money. So all of a sudden, it's okay.
Oh, there's more.
But wait, there's more.
All other citizens of Virginia who claimed Indian heritage and not African heritage were able to marry in Washington, D.C. and return to live as a couple. When we see the Loving's marriage certificate hanging on the wall in the film, we only see the top half of the certificate. The bottom half listed Mildred's race as Indian. Both of her parents were from the Rappahannock tribe, and she primarily referred to herself as an Indian. In her letter to the ACLU, she described herself as part Negro, part Indian.
Mm-hmm.
But she had 1%, so by the arithmetic of that law, it didn't really matter if she identified mostly as Indian,
Then
as
you
long
become
as
a
she
colored
had some black in her, she was considered black by the law.
But I think this is where it gets interesting, because if the Loving's marriage certificate listed her as Indian and Richard as white, there should not have been a problem under the law.
You're absolutely right.
However, the arrest warrant that was issued for Mildred described her as a Negro. And that made their marriage illegal in the state of Virginia.
Okay.
And once she was charged as a Negro, there was no correcting that technicality.
And isn't that interesting? That would even be how it's looked at. She's been charged
Yeah.
as a Negro.
Right.
That in and of itself feels
it's-
so criminal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the next part we're going to get into might
So bad.
be a little controversial, but we're going to do it anyway. Did Mildred really write to Robert Kennedy? It's commonly accepted that Mildred, as the movie shows, wrote to Robert Kennedy for assistance to return to Virginia, and she was encouraged by Kennedy to write to the ACLU for assistance. So what really happened? We're not sure. Here's what we know. We know that Mildred said she wrote to Robert Kennedy and received a response which prompted her to write to the ACLU. However, no one has ever seen the letter that Mildred sent, and no one has ever seen the letter that Robert Kennedy sent to her. When you do a search online for the letter Mildred Loving wrote to Robert Kennedy, you get a lot of images of the letter she wrote to the ACLU.
Oh, that's the letter that he read.
Additional documents you can find online relating to Loving v. Virginia include the Loving's marriage certificate, arrest warrants, the telegram sent to Bernard Cohen, one of the Loving's lawyers for the Supreme Court case, letting him know that the decision has come down, as well as various court documents from Brazil through to the Supreme Court. What we do not find an image of anywhere is the correspondence that started the whole thing. Now, at first I thought maybe the family has the correspondence and just never shared it, which is their prerogative. But as I was researching this episode, former President Donald Trump gave all of us a great lesson on how documents from a presidential administration should be handled. She wrote to Robert Kennedy in his capacity as the Attorney General of the United States under John F. Kennedy's administration, which means that correspondence should be archived.
Yep.
The National Archives allows you to search online. Nothing came up using different search terms regarding the Lovings. She signed the letter Mr. and Mrs. Richard Loving. I searched under her name. I searched under his name. There's nothing that comes up. I went to the JFK Library website, which has their archives available online. They even have a section for the Attorney General. No search terms that I used could bring up an image of the letter Mildred sent or the letter Robert Kennedy sent to her.
Would it have been appropriate for the AG to forward her to the ACLU to be giving advice like that?
That's a good question.
Because then would they keep a record of that?
I don't know. But what you always see reported outside of the movie and in the movie is that she sent a letter to Robert Kennedy. She even says that in the documentary.
Yep, she does.
And that Robert Kennedy referred her to the ACLU.
But how would she even know about the ACLU?
Right.
I mean,
Well, that's where Robert Kennedy comes in. He referred.
well, I know, but following your reasoning is that she wrote directly to the ACLU, which would be make her even more sophisticated than we think she is, meaning that she was more worldly, that would know that the ACLU would be a legal organization that does pro bono work at a constitutional level that would be interested in this.
Yeah,
right?
how would she?
I-
I
right.
agree with you. How would she know to write the ACLU unless someone had
I mean,
guided her?
in the movie, it's sort of like, I'm this lawyer. By the way, I got referred to you
This
by
is-
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
And it comes as a shock there. I mean, so, I mean, I having done archival research, I know, I appreciate your digging, and that is an interesting question.
I have a theory. My theory is a letter was never written to Bobby Kennedy. I think Mildred was more sophisticated than we give her credit for.
Could be.
I think she spent most of her life referring to herself as Indian. But when it came to this, I think she goosed it a little bit in the letter to the ACLU because the Kennedy administration was very, very popular at the time. Civil rights were taking place. They were involved in that. And I think she may have mentioned writing to Kennedy as a way to kind of raise the profile of her case. Because remember, at this time, she was in D.C. and hating it.
Right.
She did not like being there at all.
No, but that it still goes back to my point, and I think I'm in agreement with you, is that she's much more sophisticated. That it wasn't that she saw the March on Washington and the Martin Luther King speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial and said, wow, people are actually doing this, and I need to contact Robert Kennedy. So it's an enigma. I would tend to agree.
But don't you remember the part of the documentary where she said that she just kept complaining and complaining about living in D.C. and how much she hated it. So her cousin said, well, then why don't you write to Bobby Kennedy? So it seems to me that maybe her cousin could have been the one that maybe have been the impetus for her to go directly to the ACLU. It could be.
Yeah,
She did
because
not
I would
write.
imagine. I mean, I would imagine they're pretty active in DC, David.
Exactly.
Even back then, that people would know
Exactly
what they're
to
working
do.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if there isn't a letter, it could have been prompted by her cousin that said, just go to the ACLU. You know, this is what they're here
Yeah.
for.
Don't muck about. This
Right.
is
Exactly. Don't
Yeah.
look about it. Yeah, exactly.
Good. But she says that she contacted Kennedy. So I think
I have
she-
no reason to doubt her.
I know. I don't have any reason to doubt. I mean, you don't think that he gets thousands of letters and he looks at it and he just contacts the ACLU and say, you handle this?
But he didn't write to the ACLU. She did. That's the letter you find online. That's the letter that's referenced in the movie, is her letter to the ACLU saying I was referred to by the Attorney General. I think what also plays into this, in my theory, is if she marks herself as Indian on her marriage certificate, and she always identified as Indian, and her family always identified as Indian, Cohen, one of her attorneys, says she only identified as Negro to me. She only identified as black.
Well, that's what the arrest warrant said, right?
Yes.
So at that point, that's what she's working under or with.
No, you're absolutely right, because that's what the attorneys kept saying.
Yeah.
They kept going back to the arrest and what they pled guilty to, that she was a black woman.
Yeah.
But if we go with the thought that Mildred was more sophisticated than we give her credit for, isn't being black instead of Indian the thing that makes the case? Because under the racial purity law of 1924, if she were viewed as Indian, she and Richard don't have a problem.
I don't think she would have deliberately just pursued that case for the sake of it. No.
No, I think once it got, I think once she got labeled in a racial category, it was impossible in that era. Plus, you have a judge that's looking at her, and she presents at least partially black. I mean, the way the photographs. So I mean, they're going to look at her and they're going to say, "Well, you might have some white in you, but you're presenting to me with my eyes as blacks." Yeah. So I think it has less to do with what the certificate has to say is how you present.
That could be, but I really, in my opinion, I think it all has to do with the fact that she pled guilty. That's what the two lawyers kept, that was how it was going to be difficult to try to get this to the Supreme Court and how they were going to do it.
Yeah, because essentially then you have acknowledged that what they have asserted is true.
Right, exactly.
As black.
As black. So that's why she had to do that.
Yeah.
Correct.
And all because they got married. Just insane. Which all got resolved in the court case. So let's take a look at that. And what's in the movie is the movie shows that the lawyers from the ACLU got involved to help Mildred and Richard. Mildred and Richard returned to live in Virginia while the case wound its way through the courts. So what really happened? Well, what happened and what we see in the film is largely accurate. 5 years had passed since Richard and Mildred had last been arrested, and the reason they had taken no action is they just didn't understand their rights to appeal the verdict. As we see in the film, the ACLU filed a motion to vacate Judge Bazille's guilty finding. Bazille dragged his feet until a federal panel forced him to provide a ruling in 90 days. And apparently he didn't take kindly to the federal court forcing him to reply, because he doubled down on his guilty ruling and also provided the quote, which in the movie we see the ACLU attorneys responding to with glee, which is, "Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. The fact that he separated the races shows he did not intend for the races to mix."
Race is a social construct.
I mean, he served it up on a platter here.
Sure he did.
It was amazing. And when the case reached the Virginia Court of Appeals, which we see the couple outside the Virginia Court of Appeals, but the movie doesn't cover what happened. The ACLU argued that the anti-miscegenation laws violate the Due Process Clause and equal protection of the 14th Amendment. The state of Virginia argued that the 14th Amendment exempts anti-miscegenation laws, and there is no constitutionally protected right of free choice of a spouse in marriage.
So one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, talked about this. I quote her. She said, "Even political rights, like the right to vote and nearly all other rights enumerated in the Constitution, are secondary to the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. And to this category, the right to home in marriage unquestionably belongs." So for her, as a legal and political theorist, she would say the right to marry who you want to marry is perhaps one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental right that we have. So she would say to Virginia, I don't think so.
Well, I suppose you could add Justice Thomas to that list, because he seems to forget how Virginia argued the case that allows his marriage to exist. Because the question in front of the Virginia Court of Appeals was if an individual's constitutional rights override the state's right to control marriages under the state's police powers. And while the film does show the Lovings and the ACLU lawyers outside the Virginia Court of Appeals after it upheld the guilty finding, it does not share what the court said. Justice Harry Carrico upheld the guilty finding from Bazille, but suggested that the Lovings could return to Virginia and live separately, while, quote, contemplating the error of their way in going against God, nature, and the traditions of the Commonwealth.
So I would also have to say, with the South, the traditions of the Commonwealth, how many black women were raped by white men that produced mixed race offsprings. So all this is a bit of a smoke and mirror argument when you take a look at miscegenation and how it had been forced upon black women over how many centuries. So this is
Thomas Jefferson.
This is a nonsensical argument in my mind.
It should be noted that Richard and Mildred were not involved in the civil rights movement before or after the case.
I think they did more than their fair share.
I agree.
Yeah.
Richard said in a Life magazine article, "We have thought about other people, but we are not doing it because somebody had to do it and we wanted to be the ones. We are doing it for us because we want to live here." If the language used by the Virginia Court of Appeals seems harsh, I would guess that the Warren Supreme Court also found it to be out of line based on their ruling. As we discussed earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a unanimous decision which said the distinctions drawn regarding race were, quote, odious to a free people, and were subject to, quote, the most rigid scrutiny. They found that Virginia's Racial Purity Act had no legitimate purpose, quote, independent of invidious racial discrimination. That's a judicial smackdown there.
Yeah.
Yep.
The court rejected Virginia's argument that the statute was legitimate because it was applied equally to blacks and whites. That's my favorite part. It's okay for us to discriminate.
Separate but equal.
Because we discriminate against blacks and whites.
Separate but equal.
Yep.
The court also found that the law violated the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, quote, under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state.
So that's Hannah Arendt's argument.
And I think that answers your question about if it paved the way for LGBT.
Yes, it did.
It did.
I think that quote absolutely does.
Well, and it paved the way for me being able to marry my wife. But as a white male, I could always marry an Asian woman.
Yeah.
But if I were a white woman and she was an Asian man, that would not have been possible.
What happened after the case? What was in the movie? The movie concludes with Richard starting to build their house. A couple of epigraphs tell us that Richard died from a car accident when a drunk driver hit the car he was driving. It also tells us Mildred died from pneumonia in 2008. Now I mentioned gender roles earlier. One thing I wanted to mention is if you notice at the end when he's starting to build the house, and he's laying the bricks, his two boys are playing in the background, and his daughter walks up. He hands his daughter the brush and says, do you want to help me? And I think that just falls in line with what the movie does with gender roles with him and Mildred all throughout. And yeah. So what really happened? The Supreme Court ruling struck down existing miscegenation laws in 18 states. After the ruling...
So, Rob, on your biopics, I'm sorry to interject, can you put the 18 states that had those laws in the book?
I could do that, yes.
That would be, I think, worthwhile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After the ruling, a press conference was held. Mildred looked like she had a weight lifted off of her shoulders. She said, "I feel free now." Richard didn't say much of anything and looked like he was enduring one more ordeal, looking uncomfortable in a white button-up shirt. A cross was burned on Mildred's mother's lawn. Mildred thinks it was meant for her. A cross was burned on the Lovings' lawn shortly after they returned to Caroline County following the trial. Their grandson Donald said the Lovings endured constant harassment following the verdict. Richard built the house he promised to Mildred. It is on Passing Road in Milford, Virginia. At last report, no one lives there, and it is off the market. On June 29th, 1975, about a month after their 14th wedding anniversary, and 8 years after they won the right to live as husband and wife in the state of Virginia, Richard and Mildred were driving home with Mildred's sister Garnett. They were returning from visiting friends and were just 13 miles away from their home when their car was broadsided by a drunk driver who ran a stop sign. Richard died instantly. Mildred lost her right eye. In some accounts, she lost vision in her right eye. Garnett suffered minor injuries. Richard was buried in a mostly black cemetery just down the road from their house. He was 41 years old.
Wow.
Mildred joined him in 2008 at the age of 68.
Wow.
Mildred did not seek the limelight, nor join the civil rights movement, regardless of the impact she and Richard had on our country. She received a service award from her church. Her pastor compared her to Rosa Parks, which she disagreed with. She kept reiterating they did not intend for what happened to happen. They just wanted to be married. On the 40th anniversary of Loving v. Virginia ruling, Mildred lent her support to marriage equality. She said, quote, "The older generation's fears and prejudices have given way, and today's young people realize that if someone loves someone, they have a right to marry."
Yep.
She said in the same article, "I am still not a political person, but I am proud that Richard's and my name is on a court case that can help reinforce the love, the commitment, the fairness, and the family that so many people, black or white, young or old, gay or straight, seek in life. I support the freedom to marry for all. That's what loving and loving are all about."
She said that.
Yeah.
My God,
deep.
how beautifully stated. I mean, you could not have said that. A Hollywood scriptwriter could not have written that better.
No. It was a rare public statement from her. Today, support for interracial marriage is at an all-time high. When Gallup first polled about support for interracial marriage in 1958, support was at 4% of white people. By 1972, it was at 60%. By 1991, white people supported it by 80%. As of today, support for interracial marriage is at 94%,
Yeah.
which means that support across the races is equal. 93% for whites, 96% for people of color, which is within the margin of error. A majority of non-white adults have approved of interracial marriage since 1968. The poll did not see a majority of white support until 1997. Today, Loving Day is celebrated around the world on June 12th, the day the Supreme Court rendered its decision. People celebrate the day by holding community events, posting their stories online, or encouraging their governments to declare June 12th to officially be Loving Day. Governments all over the world have declared this day officially, including the county of Caroline and the state of Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stick it to him.
And with that, it's time to grade the movie Loving and find out if it is a biopic that mostly sucks on a letter grade of A through F, whole letters only, no pluses or minuses.
Oh, man.
What do you give Loving for accuracy, Dawn?
Oh, pluses or minuses?
Nope.
Yeah, none.
Then an A.
A from Dawn. Lolita?
No minuses, right?
Nope.
A.
A. David?
An A.
An A from David. I'll go an A with the rest of you. Hey, this is only the second movie to get an A grade. You were on the first one.
That's right.
Coal miner's
That's
daughter.
right.
All right.
Yeah.
There we go.
But
So
you gave us no minus.
no minus.
I
of
know there
course.
should be minuses and pluses
pluses.
because there was a little minor stuff going on there, but
Yeah.
it's really not worth downgrading it all the way to a B.
Yeah.
No, it's
I
not.
agree with you.
Or a B plus.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have graphics with pluses and minuses.
Boo!
You can edit that out.
Are you kidding? I'm going to keep that in. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Lolita.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, David.
Yindi. Yindi. Kap.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Now is the time when we fact check ourselves. I take every effort to come to our discussions prepared, but sometimes, just sometimes, a guest asks a question I wasn't ready for, or I misspeak during the discussion, or we just plain make stuff up. For instance, I said that 18 states had their anti-miscegenation laws struck down with the Supreme Court ruling of Loving v. Virginia in 1967. It was actually 16 states. Those states were Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Now, just because Loving v. Virginia did away with anti-miscegenation laws in those states doesn't mean it was clear sailing for interracial couples to get married. In 1970, 3 years after the Loving v. Virginia ruling, an interracial couple tried to get a marriage license at the office of probate judge G. Clyde Bertain in Alabama. They were told they would not be able to receive a marriage license because it was against state law. In the case of United States versus Bertain, Alabama tried to argue that there were a number of reasons why a couple may be denied a license that have nothing to do with anti-miscegenation laws, such as lack of proper identification. The problem is that this couple was never informed why they were denied. Alabama became the last state to remove anti-miscegenation laws from its state constitution in 2002, when Amendment 2 was endorsed by only 60% of the voters. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Loving v. Virginia could be overturned with the current Supreme Court, and if you think it can't, just remember, there are still all-white cemeteries in Georgia, and as recently as 2020, students in Wilcox County, Georgia had to fight to hold an integrated prom. It was held the week after the standard all-white prom. Now, you should know that before Loving v. Virginia, there were 11 states that repealed anti-miscegenation laws prior to 1887. Those states are Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Mexico, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Washington. Now, for Kansas, New Mexico, and Washington, those laws were repealed before they achieved statehood. The next round of appeals took place between 1948 and 1967, when 14 states repealed their anti-miscegenation laws without being subject to the Loving decision. Some of these states extended the repeal of these laws to Native Americans, Filipinos, Asians, East Indians, and Native Hawaiians, as well as African Americans. And those states were Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Indiana, Maryland, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, North Dakota, Oregon, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. There are 9 states that can lay claim to never having had any laws of this kind. And those states are Alaska, Connecticut, Hawaii, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Now, I do want to give a quick note here. I kind of forced my cohorts, Lolita, David, and Dawn, to vote an A on Loving, and they all expressed an interest in having plus or minuses for the letter grades, so we have revised it. It is an A minus for Loving. Only the second film to get in the A group, but it's an A minus for Loving. Well, that does it for another episode of Biopics Mostly Suck. I'd like to thank my guests, Dawn, Lolita, and David, for joining me. They were fantastic in talking about the film Loving, a beautiful, gorgeous film that, yes, it will make you cry. Sorry, you have to be a robot to not cry at this movie. You can find all of the sources we used to build this episode, as well as a couple extra videos, on our website. Go to biopicsmostlysuck.com/loving to see all of the information for this particular episode. And while you're at the website, go to the contact page and you can let us know how we're doing on this thing. Do you like it? Do you not like it? I know there's people listening all over the world. I don't know if they're the same people. I don't know if they're new people. But I do kind of want to have a little interaction with all of you out there. And let me know what you think. And if you don't do it through the contact page on our website, feel free to reach out to us on the social medias, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at the handle of @mostlysuck. And if you want, go ahead and recommend a film you'd like for us to talk about, and we'll tell the true story behind that movie, based on a true story. Take care, everyone.
Peace out, baby.